In this devlog, we'll be continuing our banking application by adding in more CRUD functionality, this time in the context of nested resources. What I mean by this is, if you remember the previous iteration, we had some CRUD for some create, read, update, delete functionality for a given bank account resource, wherein if we wanted to add a new bank account, we had to select a client existing in the database and attach that instance of a client to a new bank account instance, and it will get created for us. What we want right now is that instead of selecting a client, we'd like to create a new bank account, this time in the context of a client. Meaning we actually select a client, and then from there we can add a new bank account without having to go through the bank account form. Okay. We call this nested resources because we'd like to consider adding a new resource in the context of another resource, which in this case is the resource client. So to start things off, I'll first create some very simple CRUD functionality for the client resource, which actually just looks exactly like the bank account's CRUD functionality. Right? We have a create, update, delete, read functionality. So I can just actually replace all bank account instances with client, and even the variables with the variable client. So everything follows the same convention, and it should, I believe, have the same exact functionality as creating a new bank account. Okay, so the controller code stays the same. The routing file will have a new resources clients declaration, so that I can will allow the Rails to generate some default routes for a client resource. Okay, so if we do right, so we have it right here. We have the index, create, new, edit, show, update, and destroy functions for a given client resource, and it will work the same way as a bank account. So it means that I should have view resource as well for my clients, wherein it will have an index, new, edit, show, and all those pages as well. So let's say for clients, I have an index.html.haml right there, and then this will say something like clients database. We can attach a link to the pages to the home page of our application, same way we did for bank accounts. Right, so I'll change this to client's path, which follows the same convention for declaring resources in Rails. So something like clients, and if you go back to the root page of the application, we have a link there for clients. If you click it, it goes to the index page of clients. So we can do the same functionality wherein we'd render a partial. Did I have that for list? Oh no, I didn't have that for bank accounts. I just had the table right here. But I'd like to shorten my code again. So I'll render a partial for my list of clients that I'd pass my client's instance variable from the controller into this particular partial, the list partial, which should reside under the directory for clients. Right? So again, this one is from the controller. So if you go to the client's controller, all it's doing is that it's selecting all the clients, right, from the database, and allowing this variable to be used inside the index page of the client's resource. Right? And from the index page, I then passed it to a partial called list, where my code for the table will be found. Right? So I have some HTML table right there. I can probably have something like a T head, which will contain the name of the client. Can't remember if I had a field for client number, right? So I have a client number right there. So maybe I'll use that as the first column. So client number, and then the full name of the client, and then the probably something like number of accounts. So I'll know how many accounts this client has, and an actions column right there. Okay. And then in the T body of this partial table, I'll loop through all the clients passed to this partial. So clients.each, do C, for example, and I'll have my let's say something like C dot client number, and then C dot name. Okay, I think this should produce an error. C dot num accounts, and of course I'll do something with the actions column. So I believe this should produce an error because I don't have a variable name or a field name for a client, as well as the number of accounts for a given client. So if I refresh this, it should produce an error, right, saying undefined method name for a client. And if I actually correct that, it will also produce an error for num accounts. So I'll have to implement that inside my model. Okay. Well, actually for name, right, you can just call the toString method, but it's actually quite inefficient because we already have a toS method right here. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just use that toS method, right? And again, I can just use C instead of calling. Oh no, it's the wrong field. I can just use C, and it will automatically call the string method for this given object. So I'll just have to implement num accounts inside the client model. And if you notice, a client has many bank accounts. So to get the number of bank accounts, instead of performing some bank account query, I can just make use of this has many bank accounts to count the number of bank accounts for an instance of this client. So num accounts, the implementation will just be something like self bank accounts dot count, right, which will count the number of bank accounts for this client. So if I refresh this page, okay, so we should have something like this. All right, why is it bold? All right, I think I used TH instead of TD, so I'll just switch that with TD. Right, so I have something like that. So I'll probably have a show button right here, so it looks the same. It has the same format as my bank accounts list table. So I'll use the client path as defined by the resources convention, which requires an ID of a given client so that it goes to the show page of a client. Right, so that will be the link right there. I add a bunch of classes and show. Right, so if I click the show page, it should go to the show portion of the application, but I don't have that template yet, or I don't have that file yet. Let's create it real quickly right here, and let's just say that in the show page I know that I have an @client variable. Right, so I can just do something like client @client, and then display that client's, let's say, client number. Okay, so we have it right here, and I can probably display all the bank accounts of the client here. So just the same way we did with the index page of the client, I can use a partial to render all the accounts of this particular client and pass the bank accounts. Well, to make it consistent, I'll also call this partial bank accounts, or maybe, yeah, bank accounts will do. I'll have a variable called bank accounts inside that partial, whose value is the bank accounts for that given client. So the has many relationship will work quite nicely here because I can just call it and pass it to a variable bank accounts, which will be used inside the partial bank accounts for this particular page. So I'll go ahead and create that partial. Okay. Again, partials begin with an underscore, right? But when you actually call it in the view page, right? You disregard that underscore. Okay, so for the table for bank accounts, I have the same exact code right here. I'll probably display the account number, the balance of that bank account, and probably some actions to go to the bank account of this particular client. Okay, so we actually have some nice flow for our program so it can jump from one module to the next. Okay, so let me just display the table right there. And for the body of the table, it will just loop through all the bank accounts of that client. Bank accounts.each do bank account. Right. Okay, so here we'll just display the bank accounts number, account number, the balance. We can use the number to currency bank account dot balance, and use that unit right there. Okay, so we have the balance right there and some actions button right there. So I'll probably have a link to bank account path, bank account.id, and then I'll probably have info right there and show. Okay, so it will go to the show portion of the bank account. I can go back to bank accounts. And just so I can have a nice flow from bank accounts to client, I'll probably create this as a link to the client show page. Okay? So that would be found under bank accounts, under the index, right? The index of bank accounts. Right? So remember, you have a name right there. I can display the name of the client right here, line 18. So I want to convert that to a link that links to a client. So client path, bank account dot ID. I won't give it a class. Right, I'll just use the text for the client's name as the display for this particular link. So if I refresh this becomes a link. If I click it, I can go to the show page of the client, showing me all that client's bank accounts. Right, so this is where actually this is the part where the nested resources will come in. So the first thing I'll do is I'll declare those nested resources inside my routing file. We have a resources clients right here, right? And then if I do something like resource clients do, and then inside it I have another nested resources bank accounts. Let's first see what rails will generate for these given routes. Right. So, right. Doesn't display rate well. Okay, so I have here the nested resources routes for bank accounts, right, which is embedded inside. The resources clients. We're passing a do block to it. And what Rails did is that it generated a set of CRUD functionality, but inside the context of a given client. And that's this part right here, wherein each CRUD functionality of a bank account will always require a client ID to identify the parent resource for this particular resource. In this case, the child resource is a bank account and the parent resource is client ID. So every time we create some CRUD functionality for the bank account resource, we always have to specify that it's in the context of a client ID. Furthermore, the prefix changed from simply bank accounts, it now becomes client bank accounts. So the convention is that you still follow the same prefix as you would with any resource, but since this bank account resource is nested, we include the prefix for the parent resource together with the routes or the route prefix. Now we also have another problem right here. We have both resource for bank accounts, normal resources bank accounts, and the nested resource bank accounts right here, all of them pointing to the same controller, bank accounts controller. Right? And what I want to do is I want to specify a different controller for this, for this nested resource. And to do that, I believe the way is to, actually forgot, controller, something like clients bank accounts. Right. I forgot the syntax, but I think you can pass controller right there. So let's see what happens. Okay, hopefully the syntax is correct. All right. So okay, let's take a look at that again. In my routing file, I included a controller parameter or a controller symbol for the resources bank accounts to explicitly tell which controller will manage the CRUD functionality for this resource bank accounts. In this case, I'd like that controller to reside inside another namespace called clients, which can differentiate it from the normal bank accounts resource. That's why when we checked out Rails routes, it produced a controller that directs to that namespace clients. Now, if we do this approach, this means that in my controllers directory, right, I should have a directory here called clients, which actually works the same way as the API we did in the first video, if I'm not mistaken. Right, so we actually modularize this controller for bank accounts inside API. So if we wanted to have a namespace for clients, and then inside we can have another bank accounts controller specific for nested resource, we can do that same technique, right? So we have a bank accounts controller inside a folder, inside a directory clients, which is different from the bank accounts controller for our normal bank accounts CRUD. Now, every time we declare something inside another directory, we have to modularize it by declaring the keyword module clients before declaring the bank accounts controller class. Right. And this is where we can have our extra CRUD functionality. But what I want to do is I'd like to disregard the index method, because that the section where it displays all bank accounts is already defined by my client's show page, right? Since I'm in the context of a given client anyway, I can just do away with that index function for a given resource, for a given nested resource. So I can pass something like except index, right? So if I try to take a look at the routes again, I should this particular route should disappear, right? So if I run Rails routes, since I exempted the index for this new nested resource, I won't have that route definition right there. Okay, so I'm left with just create, new, edit, show, update, and destroy. So what I'll do is I'll program that functionality. So going inside the client's bank accounts controller, I'll have like a new method, which is different from the new method from the normal bank accounts controller, which actually operates the same way. We create a new bank account, right? And complement to new is the create method, wherein it creates a new bank account as well. But remember, we had this bank account params method that will safeguard the only attributes that can enter when you bind a resource in a Rails form, or in this case in simple form. And the syntax for that is to declare what that resource is, in this case bank account, and then just permit the needed fields. So in this case, let me just permit the account number, right? And that's the only thing that can get into the server, or that the server will process once we submit a new form. So bank account.new bank account params, and then we'll try to save that if bank account.save else end. Now remember, we're in the context of a client, so and we know that the routes will require to pass a client ID. So we can use that information to query that client record from the database before attaching it to the bank account. Okay, so going back to the controller, we'll do just that. Before trying to save that bank account, we'll extract a client and use the client ID as information to query from the database. Right? And even before saving, I'll actually put it here. Before saving, we can assign a client, the client that we've taken from the database using the parameter client ID, and attach it to a bank account before trying to save that bank account. Upon successful save, we can redirect back to the bank account show path. Okay. So now we're actually mixing the different routes. This doesn't redirect to the show path of the nested bank account resource, but rather to the normal show path of the bank account resource. Else we render new, so that brings us back to the new form. Okay. Same goes for the edit functionality in the controller. We extract the bank account using the ID. Okay, so bank account equals bank account.find params ID. Okay, just to make sure, that would be this one right here. Okay. So we're actually passing an ID to the route, and we'll use that information to query for the bank account needed for editing. Same goes for client right here. We still need to attach a client to that bank account before trying to update it. Okay. So before trying to update it with the parameters here, I'll first attach this client. I should switch this. Bank account equal, rather dot client equals client. Right, and then I'll try to update it by calling if bank account dot update and pass bank account params. Okay, upon successful update, then I'll redirect back to the bank account path, else render the edit. Well, actually, this one should be the functionality of the update rather than the edit, because the edit will just display the form and the update will be the one to process the updated version of the bank account. Okay, so let me just refactor. That was actually a mistake. Let me just refactor here. This one should be here for the update, and all edit has to do is to edit is to display the form. Now, I should also include the client here so that the form will know which client ID is to be passed back to the server when it tries to update the form. I think the same goes for new. Okay, so if you notice, every method in this nested resource controller will have to reference the parent resource, which in this case is the client, by taking the client from the database using the client underscore ID parameter from the URL. Okay. I'll implement one more method in the controller, which is the destroy. I won't actually need the client for this. I just need that bank account. And the same logic for destroying a bank account. Okay, so for example, bank account dot well, actually, I won't implement destroy. I'll leave it up to the bank accounts module, since the destroy part is already implemented there. Just so I'll be less repetitive. I won't have to repeat the code in this for this particular application. Okay, so the only things we have here in a nested resource, at least normally, would be a new create, edit, and update functionality in the context of a given client. Okay, so what's next? Oh, so since I'm not using the destroy method, as well as the index, as well as the show, I can modify the routes and say except index, show, and destroy. Right? Because I'll only need the new create, edit, and update methods for this given nested resource. Okay, I think that looks right. Okay. So we're only left with the new, if I generate the routes again, we're only left with the new edit, update, create methods for this given resource. Now, okay, I think that's okay. Okay, so the next thing I'll do is to create the views relating to this nested resource bank accounts. So it follows the same convention. If I have it under a nested, under a directory or under a namespace, or in this case under a module clients, the views will also follow, meaning I should have a clients directory, which we already have right here, and in it I should have that directory for bank accounts. Right. So now our clients directory will share some views with its nested resource bank account, which will contain the new.html.haml, the edit.html.haml, and probably the partial for the form.html.haml. Right? Okay, so these are the view files. Before I do the view files, I'll first edit the controller and try to simplify things. If you notice, we have repetitive code, namely this thing. Oh, sorry. Namely this one, right? We keep querying for a client in the methods new, create, edit, and update, right? So we actually have 4 lines. So if we wanted to shorten this, we can call the controllers before action, and I'll pass to it a method called load parent object. Okay, you can call it anything you want because this method will run before an action is invoked for this particular controller. Okay, in this case, that method I'd like to do is called load parent object. And let me put it under private right here and say load parent object, which in this case is my client. Right? So I'll copy this, or actually cut this and paste it here. Right? So this one runs before invoking, let's say, update, or before invoking edit, or even before invoking create and new. Okay. So this makes our code much cleaner, okay, and much shorter as well. Okay, load parent object, client.find params client ID. Right, so since this is an instance variable, even if the function ends, it sets this at client to be part of this entire class. That's why we can still call it here as well as here, right? Without having to declare at client equals client.find. Another practice, I guess, for the before action to simplify things would be to shorten these 2 lines, line number 21 and line number 25. They're the same exact code, so I can use that repetitive code and wrap it around another before action call in this controller and say something like load object, right? Which in this case, the object is the bank account, but I'd only like to apply this action to the edit function or the edit method as well as the update method. Okay, so we can pass only to tell Rails that to fire this method only for these actions edit and update for this controller. Okay. And all load object will do is it will instantiate, right? It will instantiate a bank account, or rather extract a bank account from the given ID parameter. Okay. So I can remove this, and I can remove from edit and update, right? Okay. So our code becomes much shorter and much more manageable, right? So if update, we know that we already have an at bank account variable as well as an at client because both are fired, right? Both are fired before calling this thing. Okay, actually, I forgot this line. Bank account.client equals at client. We need this to attach the client instance inside our bank account instance. I think there's an order here, so maybe what I'll do is, all right, both are loaded anyway before calling the method. Okay, so I think this should work. Yeah, I think this should work. So, okay, so let me go ahead and implement the necessary forms. Okay, so for the new section, I probably have something like header 1, new bank account for client, and then whatever the name of the client is. Okay. And I'll have the render partial form right there and pass. Okay, remember we're in nested resources, so most likely we'll have two variables that we can pass to this form. The client variable, which is our parent object, as well as our bank account variable, which is our main object, which is the bank account. Right? So we pass it to the partial form, which we have right here. Okay. Aside from that, I'll just go ahead and quickly implement the edit, which is the exact same thing. It uses the exact same form, but I'll just change text here for edit. Okay. All right. So for the form, this one works quite a bit different. We're still using simple form, but it works differently from the form right here. Okay, this is the original bank account form, okay, wherein we pass the resource for simple form. But since we're dealing with two resources, simple form should have a way we need to have a way to tell simple form to pass the information from this bank account into the nested route that includes a client ID. Now, the way simple form handles that is using the same syntax, simple form for, but this time passing the parent object inside some array before the bank account object, which is the main object that we bind to the form. Okay. Now, I'll copy the code from the original bank account form, but instead of including the client association, I'll just include the account number as well as the button tags. Right, so if I decide not to create a new bank account for this client, then I'll just redirect back to the client path. So I'll have something like this. Okay. So again, the difference is that if you're using simple form with nested resources, right, you have to pass the parent resource so that simple form knows where to actually bring this main resource object to, which will use the default routing for nested resources. Okay. So once we have that, I like to call this form from within a client. And I'll probably have a button right here, link to new client bank account path. Right. So the convention is that we include, zoom in right there, we include the parent resource, in this case client, in the prefix of the path, which will require a client ID or whatever the parent ID is, which in this case is client.id. We put some classes right there, button primary, and do new bank account. Right. So going back to the page, we can see here the button new bank account. If you can see the URL there, we'll pass the ID of the client. Okay, and it will go to the new form that we just created, new bank account for this given client. Without needing the drop down for the client right there, I can just include a new account number for this given bank account. Okay. If I click cancel, it will go back to the client show page. If I click new bank account, I can add in more bank accounts. I say 00001, or no, the validation still stay the same, I believe. So save bank account, it will say, oh, so apparently we don't have an account for 0100. Oh, I missed the 0 right there. Right. So it actually created a new bank account for this client and went to the show page of the bank account. Okay. Just add more flow and more improvement for this show page for a bank account. I can include a reference to link me back to the client, and I'll probably put it beside back to bank accounts. Okay, so back to bank accounts, go back to the main index page for bank accounts. So if I wanted to go back to the client that owns this bank account, I'll do something like link to client path bank account.client.id, which will also be a default button. And I'll say back to even make the button dynamic, say bank account.client, right, which will say back to that given client. Okay, so if I click this, my client now has 2 bank accounts and I don't need this, so I'll try to delete it. Go to show, delete bank account. Okay, let me improve the bank accounts controller, the main bank accounts controller. What I want to do is when I delete the bank account, it will redirect me to the client show page instead of the bank accounts index, which we have right here. Okay, but notice that after this point, the bank account gets destroyed, so we won't be able to reference it anymore. It will actually be a nil value in this after this line. So what I can do is I can reference that client. Okay, now I won't be using an instance variable because I won't pass it to any view anyway. Okay, so actually I can just use normal variables here. And have a reference to the client before it gets destroyed. So something like bank account.client. Oops, sorry. Something like that. Okay, OC. All right. So once I have a reference for the client, after I'm able to destroy that bank account, instead of redirecting to the index of bank account, I'll redirect to the show page of the client right there, client_path. Okay, so if I refresh this, try to delete this bank account, I have 0 balance anyway, so it should delete that and go back to the show page of the client containing the new bank accounts. Okay, so if I create a new bank account, 010001234561, okay, try to save it. Okay, if there's an error, if you notice it did not use the original bank account form but use the nested bank account form, and say that this account has already been taken. Okay, so if I save this, okay, I create that new bank account, it redirects to the show path. I can go to either the index of the bank accounts or back to the customer bank accounts, or the client that owns this bank account. In this case, this guy right here. Okay. All right, so let me just review the system. Okay, so I have 2 accounts and 1 client. Okay, I have some navigation right here wherein I can go to a client's index page, show, display all the bank accounts, and I can show a bank account. Okay, this actually goes to the show page of the bank account, but I can create a new bank account in the context of this client without having to use the drop down from the original bank accounts form. Okay, so new bank account will just allow me to specify the account number. Okay, so that's it for nested resource. Actually, before I end this session, what I want to do is to complete the CRUD cycle for the clients. All right, so I think I have the client's controller right here. Well, I actually just implemented the controller methods. I should implement the views as well for the client, which is what I forgot. Which can be a good review as well for how we do the whole CRUD for a normal resource, right? So we have new, we have edit, probably have a form right there. Okay, so for new, I just have something like new client. For edit, I'll have edit client. And edit client will have a client instance right there, and it will render a partial form. Oh, sorry, render partial form locals client. Okay, same code for this one. Oops. Okay, so just render the form, and then inside the form we have something like just copy the form from bank accounts. The same exact thing anyway, but instead it uses different fields. So let me just first replace bank account with client. Right, bank account with client. Client doesn't have an account number, so just add some bootstrap stuff here. It's a first name, a last name, a middle name, and a last name. Doesn't have this association here. I'll say something like save client record. This first column will have f.input first name class, or rather input HTML class form controller. Right, so you have it here. Instead of first, this is middle. Instead of first, this is last. Have another row which spans the entire row. Column spans the entire row. This one will contain the client number. Input HTML form control. Right. Okay, so I think this looks okay. So from the main index page, bank accounts, just use the same format. Probably have a link to the new client right here. New client path. New client. Okay, so if I go back to the home page, the root page. Okay, number of clients 1. I have clients, brings me to the client database. I have, if I want to create a new client, I have the form right there. Okay, let me see if this works. So something like, let's say client number 2. Let's say this guy. Let's see the record. What can be blank? Okay, so here's a nice example for how strong parameters work. Clients controller. Okay, so what I did is I tried to fill up this form, right? And I tried to submit it, but it produced an error. It says can't be blank, and all my input is actually gone. Now this will happen if inside the client's controller I don't have. Well, I actually have it right. I actually have the strong parameter declaration right here, client params, right? But the only fields I allowed to be submitted will be the account number and the client, which was from the old code for the from the bank account. So I'll modify this and instead permit the fields that are included in the form. So that would be the client number, the first name, the middle name, and the last name. Okay. So let me just refresh. Okay, if I'll need a button here from the client's database, from the list. I won't put it in the list, probably somewhere here. Okay, in the index page I probably have a link to new client path. Give it a class, new client, example. Right, new client. Probably have an edit button right there from the show page. So something like link to edit client path. Already implemented the controllers for this, so it should work accordingly. Edit client. Okay, so if I do edit client, okay, it will bring me back to the form. I can edit some stuff. If I click cancel, it will go back to the root page, go to clients. Actually, I don't want to go back to the root page if I try to edit. Let's say if I click cancel, I'll instead go to the clients database, right? Or let's try something a bit more dynamic. From the form rather, okay. I want to have a more dynamic cancel button wherein if the client is a new record, so active record has this method called new record, which I think we've seen in the load defaults method. If the client is a new record, I'll instead redirect to client's path, which is the index page of the client resource, right? Else, meaning if it's not a new record, it's an existing client, meaning we're trying to edit this client, I'll link this to the show page of the client. Okay. So it will look exactly the same, wherein both are actually cancel buttons inside the form. But if I'm editing a client and I click cancel, it will go to the show page of the didn't work. Let me try that again. All right, yeah, it went to the show page of a given client. If I try to create a new client, the flow is not good. If I try to create a new client and I click cancel, it will instead go to the client's database. Okay, so let me just create a new client right here. Let's say new client has this client number. That name right there, save client record. Okay, so we have a new client right here with no bank accounts. So I'll create a new bank account for this client. Okay, so this is a nested resource. We have a new bank account nested for this client right there. And as you can see, the URL actually passes the client ID to it. If we save it, it will go to the show page of that bank account resource for this given client. Right, so I guess that's it for this session. Okay, so we have 3 bank accounts now, 1 that belongs to this guy and 2 that belongs to this guy right here. Okay, so that ends the nested resource coding session. For the next coding session, at least for this application, I'll probably fix the UI, right? And integrate something like admin LTE so that we have a nice template for this application, since our functionality is starting to grow for this application. And probably include things like a login and logout. Right, so that's it for this live coding session for nested resources.